and to be inside. So thanks for coming to hear Jane's talk. She's been working long and hard on it. And my name is Molly Faulkner. I'm the president of the Wayland Museum and Historical Society. Just a quick announcement. We've got these programs in the back in case you don't have one or trying to remember what we did already, what's coming up. There's a major change, which is my program, which was scheduled for the last Sunday in April on the poor. I'm not doing. I'm not ready. I'm not ready. So I'm going to do it next year, probably in the fall, possibly in the winter. But we do have a program coming up after that in May, just after a very quick business annual meeting, and that's on moving houses. I mean, not moving household goods, moving one's home. So welcome to Jane Siaka, and she's going to talk about women in Wayland or East Sudbury, or Lydia Mariah Child.
I guess it's Wayland if it's 1837. Just barely. Thank you all for coming. I know it's a beautiful day out, and I appreciate having you here a lot. So today I'm going to talk about two petitions. Well, it's all the same petition, but one is a reproduction of the petition as it looked when it went in 1837, and this is a transcription of it. So I have two copies, and one is transcribed and one is a facsimile. This was an 1837 petition that was submitted, so I thought, to the House of Representatives to protest the existence of slavery in the District of Columbia, which came under the jurisdiction of Congress. The petition read, so if you're straining to read it, I'll read it to you. It says to the House, it says petition, one thing. Then it says to the House of Representatives of the United States, and the undersigned women, and then written in script is Wayland, Massachusetts. Deeply convinced of the sinfulness of slavery and keenly aggrieved by its existence in a part of the country over which Congress possesses exclusive jurisdiction in all cases whatsoever, do most earnestly petition your honorable body immediately to abolish slavery in the District of Columbia and also to put an end to the slave trade in the United States. We also respectfully announce our intention to present the same petition yearly before your honorable body, that it may at least be a memorial of us, that in the holy cause of human freedom we have done what we could. So that is what the petition says. It is signed by 49 women who were either members of or attended the Evangelical Trinitarian Church of Wayland, what we know today as the Trinitarian Congregational Church on Cochituate Road. Unknown at the time was that they had taken the first steps as women into the political realm, a step that would end over 80 years later with the passage of the 19th Amendment giving women the right to vote. The copies you see before you came from the Wayland Historical Society files about 1982, when Henny Skeen, who I was told by Joe Gessel, who doesn't remember, is this coming back to you at all or not yet? Okay, so this is what the story I was told. When a member discovered it in the papers of John Quincy Adams at the Massachusetts Historical Society. This is when I was studying slavery in the 1990s, I came across them, both the transcription and the copy. Two of the women who are signers of the petition lived at the Grout house next door, which is the headquarters, the Wayland Museum and Historical Society, the headquarters of the Wayland Historical Society, and they are Susanna Grout, the lead petitioner, and Susan Grout, who is her daughter. And notice I say is because to me they're still around. And so I'm going to pay particular attention to them. Why did I lose my... Okay. I don't have a mouse. So first I'm going to, so we're all on the same page, I want to tell you what I mean by a petition. Dan Carpenter is a Harvard professor who is studying and is going to write a book on petitions. I came across his articles on the internet, and I found that they were restricted and that I could not have access to them. So I emailed Dan Carpenter, whom I didn't know, and 2 minutes later I had his articles on petitions. So I want to give him special credit for helping me out. So according to him, in a paper called When Canvassers Become Activists, Anti-Slavery Petitioning, and the Political Mobilization of American Women, we defined a petition as an organized request for political redress or policy of some sort, which contains two essential elements: a prayer or request or expression of grievances, and a signatory list presenting those persons who have affixed their names in approval of the prayer. So that is certainly the case. Petitions were used for centuries. I think they go back to the Magna Carta by groups or individuals to request a redress of grievances to a higher governmental power, even to a king. And when we were still a colony of Great Britain, we often did send petitions to the king and to Parliament for redress of our grievances. Accompanying the petitions in the files was some information on Laelius Hyde, the minister of the Evangelical Trinitarian Church from 1835 to 1841, who was credited always with initiating the petition. Reverend Hyde was an early opponent of slavery. As early as 1820, he had published several articles in favor of freeing the slaves. He was subsequently dismissed from the Congregational Church in Salisbury, Connecticut in 1822 for offending influential parishioners. Most of the information on Laelius Hyde came from a professor named Mary de Jong, who was researching American hymn writers, including Laelius Hyde's wife, Abby Bradley Hyde. So, since Laelius and Abby had been married since she was 18, Mary's research encompassed Laelius as well as Abby. The bulk of Mary's information came from the Bradley Hyde papers at Radcliffe's Schlesinger Library and the archives of Old Sturbridge Village. In 2003, I went to Schlesinger Library to see the Bradley Hyde papers and came home with information which concentrated on Reverend Hyde and his anti-slavery writings, which I set aside. In 2007, I also had an exchange of many emails with Mary de Jong about what she had discovered on Reverend Hyde. It was my intention to give a program on Laelius Hyde and his abolitionist activities. And although I will return to Reverend Hyde later in this presentation, this talk will not concentrate on him, but on the 49 women who signed the petition to Congress and what might have motivated them to do so. So in 25 years, I have gone from largely ignoring these courageous women to making them the centerpiece of this talk. As early as, okay, this is one of the strictures that these women were under at the time that they signed this petition. So this comes from English common law, but it's still applied here in 1837 by marriage, according to Sir William Blackstone. The husband and wife are one person in law. That is, the very being or existence of the woman is suspended during the marriage, or at least incorporated and consolidated into that of the husband. Well, that's the English accent. So under whose wing, protection, and cover she performs everything, and is therefore called a femme covert, not femme couverte, because he's English. And as we know, there are still parts of the world today that have similar laws limiting women's rights, but it no longer applies in this country. Unmarried women did not even rate a law that covered their situation, as their failure to marry was considered an aberration. Widows were entitled to dower rights, which basically allowed them to live in part of the house their husbands had owned, and now most likely one of their children owned, until they died or remarried. While there was near universal white male suffrage by the 1830s, no woman had the right to vote in America. They did, however, have one right vis-a-vis the government that was granted to them, the right to petition. And here it is, Article 1 of the Constitution. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. There it is. Beginning in the 1830s, the abolition of slavery became a hot topic for a minuscule group of radical reformers who called for the immediate emancipation of all slaves in the United States. And Massachusetts, along with Philadelphia, I can't help it, my husband tells me that's not parallel. It should be Pennsylvania, but it wasn't all of Pennsylvania, became the primary centers of activity. For our purposes, let's call the first issue of William Lloyd Garrison's The Liberator on January 1st, 1831, the start of the movement that will continue until slavery was abolished nationally in the wake of the Civil War. In 1833, Garrison and his supporters founded a national organization called the American Anti-Slavery Society, and that same year, in 1833, Boston women founded the Boston Female Anti-Slavery Society. It should not surprise anyone, and anyone who knows me knows that I love to talk about Lydia Mariah Child, that she was one of the founders of the Boston Female Anti-Slavery Society. And this is 20 years before she does take up residence in Wayland. Right from the start, there was dissension among members of these societies between Garrison supporters who favored women's full participation and those who would give them a limited role, yes, including some of the women who felt that way. In 1840, the issue of women in abolition would split the movement and cause a new faction to depart from the Garrison wing. But fortunately, this is after the time period of this talk. No two people contributed more to these tensions than Sarah and Angelina Grimke, two sisters from South Carolina who had grown up in a slaveholding family. In my memory of the 1960s and 1970s, the struggle over Black power and women's lib was angry and sometimes even violent. But this was the 1830s when women were the acknowledged guardians of moral law and Christian values. The Grimke sisters in their Quaker garb and most of the other so-called radical women abolitionists fit this description to a T. And here they are, the Grimkes, who you could not imagine going out and burning their bras or attending Woodstock. And so there is Angelina and Sarah Grimke, making their first appearances in 1836 in Philadelphia and New York. The Grimkes were eagerly sought out by Garrison and the Boston Female Anti-Slavery Society to come to Massachusetts on a speaking tour. The sisters took Massachusetts by storm, covering the state tirelessly to recruit women to the abolitionist cause. Their message was geared to women, but men could and did attend, and that was called promiscuous audiences. The Grimke sisters spoke to promiscuous audiences. Their subject was abolition, but their message spoke equally to the right of a woman to have a strong presence in the anti-slavery movement, primarily through women's constitutional right to petition. On February 21st, 1838, Angelina Grimke was the first woman to ever address, she's the one on the left, to address the Massachusetts legislature. The essence of their message was, especially, let me urge you to petition. Men may settle this and other questions at the ballot box, but you have no such right. It is only through our petitions that you can reach the legislature. It is therefore peculiarly your duty to petition. The Grimke's speaking tour stirred up the deepest passions, both pro and con, about the role of women in the abolitionist movement. And no group was more passionately outspoken against women's participation than the leaders of the Massachusetts Congregational Church Association, which included Lavius Hyde's evangelical Trinitarian Church here in Wayland. The association's Pastoral Letter, which appeared in August 1837, barely a month before Wayland's congregational women petitioned, took aim at the Grimke sisters without mentioning them by name. But the message was clear. The power of woman is her dependence, flowing from the consciousness of that weakness which God has given her for her protection and which keeps her in those of life that form the character of individuals and of the nation. We especially deplore the intimate acquaintance and promiscuous conversation of females with regard to things which ought not to be named, by which that modesty and delicacy which is the charm of domestic life and which constitute the true influence of women in society are consumed and the way opened, as we apprehend, for degeneracy and ruin. We cannot therefore but regret the mistaken conduct of those who encourage females to and ostentatious part in measures of reform and countenance any of that sex who so far forget themselves as to itinerate in the character of public lecturers and teachers. Of course, this was and here this is right after the same church association declared, resolved that the existence of American slavery is opposed to the natural rights of man, to the law of God, and to the spirit of the gospel, and therefore is a sin which ought to unite the efforts of all Christians for its speedy extermination. Of course, this is what the women were trying to say all along, that it took all of them to exterminate slavery. While petitions were not specifically addressed, women's place in the anti-slavery movement was unmistakable in the Pastoral Letter. Listen to your ministers and stay home, and convince men and children to adopt your beliefs. But the wheels were already in motion. According to Keith Melder in Beginnings of Sisterhood, by 1837, the petition movement was organized as a systematic national enterprise with regional and local offices and thousands of volunteer workers to circulate the forms sent out from a central headquarters. In Massachusetts, opportunities for acquiring petitions were plentiful. Garrison's The Liberator printed petitions that you could clip out and then fill in locally. The Boston Female Anti-Slavery Society sent petitions throughout the Commonwealth to be delivered to willing volunteers to distribute locally, or you could just go by their office and pick up one in Boston in person. So here we're going to take another look at that petition. And you can see very obviously that it is part of a larger movement, because this is all printed in advance, and all these women did was write Wayland, Massachusetts. And some of them, they even had to say women as opposed to inhabitants or men, but this one was obviously geared solely to the women, because the woman is already a part of that written form. And what was the effect on Congress of this avalanche of petitions by women, men, even children protesting actions of the government to perpetuate or expand slavery? It is hard to judge, as Congress never read them, debated them, or ruled on them. For that, we have to thank the infamous gag law. And that introduces yet another avenue for exploration into the petition campaign. So here's John Quincy Adams, and his role. The gag law was a House procedural measure, a resolution to reject out of hand all anti-slavery petitions passed at the beginning of each session from 1836 through 1840, when it was made a standing rule of the House and finally rescinded at the end of 1844. In the Senate, this lasted until 1850. These petitions were simply laid on the table and given no consideration. The champion for repeal was former president and current House of Representatives from Massachusetts, John Quincy Adams. Although Adams had no use for slavery, he was not an abolitionist. He first and foremost was an upholder of the U.S. Constitution that his father, John Adams, helped to draft. Most of the Massachusetts petitions under the gag rule that were presented to the House of Representatives were introduced and encouraged by John Quincy Adams. All Wayland petitions in 1837 came under the gag rule. The signers knew their fate. And I say petitions because I'm just talking about one, but these are all the petitions that came from Wayland in 1836 and 1837.
Could you read the cartoon that you just...
Oh, I can. I knew somebody would ask me that. Okay. So it is kind of saying that he's, he's laying on the table and he's, I can't read it, but I can tell the point was that it says abolition frowned upon. So that is, he is protecting these petitions and causing a lot of trouble. So I beg your pardon on that one. But so there were actually a number of petitions that went to the House of Representatives in 1836, one in 1836, and the rest all in September 1837, all initiated by members of the Trinitarian Congregational Church, the Trinitarian Evangelical Trinitarian Church back then. So in September 18th, 1837, remonstrances against the annexation of Texas to the Union, petition of Lavius Hyde, and 36 other inhabitants of Wayland. 1837, remonstrances against the annexation of Texas to the Union of the States of Susanna Grant, which was misspelled as Grant, but it was really Grout, and 57 other women in Wayland, Massachusetts, memorial praying for the abolition of slavery in the District of Columbia, again, Lavius Hyde, sundry petitions praying for the abolition of slavery and the slave trade in the territories, sundry memorials remonstrating against the admission of any new slaveholding state into the Union of the United States, of Lavius Hyde and 33 inhabitants of Wayland. And again, these are all generated at the same time, and they only asked the House of Representatives for things that they could control, because slavery was a matter for state jurisdiction, but they had control over slavery in the District of Columbia and all these other issues as well. So the one for District of Columbia was the most popular cause. There were others that needed to be addressed. So ironically, the petition that I loved for 25 years and knew about is not on that list, if you notice. So that is not there. And of course, I ran into a little roadblock in that the National Archives were closed for over a month, but I finally did connect with them and get some answers. And that is, there is no record. This came from the National Archives, all the Wayland petitions for the 1830s. And so this petition found in the Adams Papers, I now believe that it was never submitted, but that it was, perhaps it had a flaw in it or some reason that Quincy Adams withheld it. However, the intent was certainly there, and since it is the only one I have with signatures at the moment, it must serve as the basis of the talk. As you can see, another petition with Susanna Grout's name did make it to Congress, so I feel even more people signing that particular one. And 57 as opposed to 49, so I feel safe in using it as a model. In addition, all of the petitions submitted from Wayland in September 1837 originated with the same group, primarily members of the Evangelical Trinitarian Church under the ministry of Lavius Hyde. We now know that the signatures were part of a well-organized and carefully, I'm lost this again. I'm talking too much and not doing my job over here. We now know that the signatures were part of a well-organized and carefully orchestrated movement to get as many women as possible in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts to place their names on petitions protesting and actions by Congress furthering or expanding slavery. And the big issue was really expanding slavery at this time. Wayland's Evangelical Church was a highly unusual source for the anti-slavery movements, one of few instances where the central core group can be determined. Almost all women's petitions originated in a door-to-door canvassing of a particular neighborhood, not within an organized group. Lydia Mariah Child headed a petition drive in Boston that gathered 3,028 signatures by volunteers, largely pounding the pavement, leading her to declare, "Petitioning is the most odious of all tasks." While Reverend Hyde was the lead petitioner on 5 petitions in September 1837, protesting slavery and an obvious proponent, it is impossible to assess his role in the women's petitions. even whether or not he was present when they were signed. However, it is quite obvious that the lifeblood of his church was the women. And here is, it's amazing what you find online today. For somebody like me, who's an older person and not my grandchildren, it just blew my mind. This is 1837, and this is the South Middlesex Association of the the Massachusetts Congregational Society, in which you see Lavius Hyde, the minister. There are a total of 13 males, and there are 61 females who are members of that society. So they contain, the ones that contain women's signatures represent a large percentage of the female membership. The one with 57 signatures leaves only 4 who did not sign, and the one with 49 signatures leaves 12 who did not sign. To me, this indicates that each woman had to be familiar enough with the issues to make an individual decision to sign or not sign the petition. And here is the Trinitarian Congregational Church. In fact, the Evangelical Trinitarian Church, still in the same place, was less than 10 years old when it submitted anti-slavery petitions. In 1828, a small group of congregants opposed to what they saw as liberalizing tendencies in the mother church, the first parish or Unitarian church today, separated from the established church, which was founded almost 200 years earlier, and started a new church. The new church members were largely women. This was no easy decision, and in many cases caused disharmony in families. And here we come to one of our residents of the Grout Herd House, Susan Grout, who was one of the founders of this new church in 1828 and a signer of the 1837 petition. She was unmarried and lived with her bachelor brother, William Grout, a staunch Unitarian, next door at the Grout Herd House Museum. In addition, the minister of First Parish in 1828 was none other than Susan's brother-in-law, Reverend John Burt White. Susan never regretted her decision. At the 1878 50th anniversary sermon of the founding of the Trinitarian Church, it says this about Susan Grout. In the death of Susan Grout, which took place in September last, the church lost one whose prayers and efforts for its prosperity never faltered. Though crippled with age and weakness, still her feet never grew weary in carrying her to the house of God, her spiritual home. We shall long remember her last Sabbath on earth, which found her filling her place in the sanctuary, an eager listener still, a hungry eater of God's word. Another signer, and no picture, of Susanna Grant, that's on the thing, Susanna Grout, Susan's mother, who was 77 years old and also living at the Grout Herd House Museum when she affixed her name to 2 petitions, even though it wound up incorrectly transcribed as Grant. In everything I read, the lead petitioner was considered either the initiator of the petition or a prominent person whose name would inspire others to sign. While I cannot say with certainty, I think Susanna was granted this honor because she was the widow of Silas Grout, a veteran of the Revolutionary War. Susanna herself had lived through the Revolutionary War and had, through a law passed in 1836, just become eligible for a pension for her husband's service at her age. Susanna had lived through the birth of the United States and perhaps appreciated than most of her fellow signers what it meant to be granted that one right in the U.S. Constitution, the right to petition. This house still stands, 15 Old Sudbury Road, a historic house, what we call the Ebenezer Ames House today, and that was the home of Abby Bradley Hyde, Reverend Hyde's wife, who was another signer of the 1837 petition, along with daughters Julia and Adeline. She lived at the parsonage here. This was the congregational parsonage at 15 Old Sudbury Road. When Wayland historian, and I'll appreciate, I call him Alfred Sereno, but it might be Sereno. Do you know, Gretchen, which one it is? No. Okay. Hudson compiled the Annals of Wayland in 1891. His biographies of prominent Waylanders included Abby Hyde, not Lavius Hyde. She was an important 19th century writer of hymns, important enough to have her papers housed at Schlesinger Library. Don't fear, I am not going through all 49 women, but I will mention one more, and her name is Lucy Francis, Lydia Mariah Child's sister-in-law. Anyone who knows me knew I couldn't do this without mentioning Lydia Mariah Child. Mariah's brother James Francis and his family had lived in Wayland since the early 1820s and also lived here when Mariah came to town in the 1850s. Very little is known about James Francis, a farmer, but Mariah's biographers always make a point of mentioning his opposition to anti-slavery and the fact that his sister's stands caused him, and I quote, great grief. Despite any feelings James might have had, and despite the fact that under the law he could have prevented her from signing, his wife Lucy and two of their daughters affixed their signatures to that 1837 petition. While I am uncertain whether or not they were affiliated with the Congregational Church, they were Lavius and Abby Hyde's nearest neighbors. Women, of course, were used to coming together to do good, whether to help their neighbors in childbirth or sickness or to work in benevolent associations. The Evangelical Trinitarian Church had formed the Ladies' Benevolent Association in May 1829, and Wayland's Female Charitable Society, consisting of women from primarily Wayland's first parish, began to meet as early as 1820. But that was on a smaller stage. The petition drive to recruit women in the 1830s is the first mass mobilization of females in support of a political cause in the history of the United States. It is the first foray into the political realm for women at a time when their lives were constricted by law, by the clergy, and by the men who controlled them. And again, quoting Dan Carpenter, petitioning allowed these women to forge important ties to one another and to raise consciousness of their status as women whose voices and liberties were restricted and for whom the petition was so crucial. The petitions that these Wayland women signed had other daunting drawbacks that you've heard that might have given pause to less intrepid individuals. They submitted their petitions and signed their names despite the Massachusetts Congregational Church Association's views on their entering the political sphere. And lastly, the gag rule, which meant all Wayland petitions that entered the House of Representatives were immediately tabled and never given a reading or acted upon. Again, quoting Dan Carpenter, many women in the northern states were particularly incensed and threatened by what they saw as an attempt to block one of their only channels, if not their only channel, of a political voice, the constitutional right to petition. After passage of the gag rule, women petitioned in greater numbers to demonstrate their commitment to protest against the restriction of their petition expressed voice. In short, women acted just like people do. the denial of one of the few rights that women had roused, not quelled, their passion and furthered the momentum of sisterhood that was the foundation of the women's suffrage movement. And again, quoting Keith Melder in Beginnings of Sisterhood, feelings of sisterhood helped many American women to think of themselves as distinct from or even in opposition to men. Sisterhood strengthened women's collective identity by working and associating for some common purpose, whether sociability or social change. Women could experience the accomplishment of group effort in contrast to the isolation so many wives and mothers endured in individual households. This could, of course, apply to widows and unmarried women, as well as married women. Susanna and Susan Grout, Lucy Francis and Abby Hyde did not go on to become leading lights in the women's movement. They were not at Seneca Falls, nor did they befriend Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. They did not go on to become the 19th century version of bra burners. We know little of their future interest in anti-slavery and women's rights, although I firmly believe they maintained their conviction stated in the petition that slavery was a sin. Information on most so-called early 19th century lives is scarce, but especially so for women who appear on no voting lists and few tax or probate records. But when I sought out their lives at the Historical Society and on the internet, I found more than I expected. I felt I got to know them, especially Susan and Susanna, as I had not known them for the 40 years I had spent in their house, and all because of that one piece of paper in our files with their signatures on it. Here is one example from the Wayland Historical Society. It is Joshua Kendall's account books from the early 1800s. We have that. And that is, you'll see Mrs. Grout mentioned there. Susan was born in 1797, so she may enter your children in there. So that is I also found at the files in the Grout Herd House, but it's in Silas Grout's file, a copy of the legal document that Susanna Grout had to sign to procure her widow's pension. There is no Susanna Grout file at the house yet, but there will be. And then the 1840 census on Ancestry, I found the 1840 census record for Susanna. If you notice, she is listed as a veteran. I don't know whose doing this is, but I think Susanna would be pleased by it. And also in the on Ancestry, in the probate files, I found this document naming Susanna the executor of Silas's estate when he died in 1820, a job she handed over to her eldest son. Also in the probate records is the record of her widow's thirds or dower rights that would provide her shelter for the rest of her life in her children's home. Her birth record and death record in 1842 are also there. She is buried with Silas at North Cemetery, where I have often viewed her gravestone without really knowing much about her. As far as Susan is concerned, I see all this time a photograph taken in 1868 of the Grout Herd House. And here is Susan Grout, probably in the doorway. So she lived for 80 years, her entire life, at the Grout Herd House Museum. I have often viewed her in this without knowing much about her. I can look again now with new eyes. Also, I found in the Herd Family Library, in the Herd Room at the house, some books that belong to Susan Grout, and this does say that she attended Bradford Academy in May 1818, we never knew, unless you read that, you would not ever have known that she participated in one of the very early movements of the women and young girls going off to academy. So that is our only knowledge that she did leave home at all in this. So also in the town's valuation lists, also at the house, you can view her tax records. She was 1/4 owner of the house, as was her brother William. So there is Susan Grout. And she also owned part of the barn and mowing and tillage. So she is represented. And then in 1870, on Ancestry, the census presumes that she and her bachelor brother William were married, still considered women's normal state, keeping house. See it? Okay. She also left a will, Susan found on Ancestry, in which, in addition to gifts to her nieces and nephews, she left contributions to a number of charities and her beloved Congregational Church. Perhaps Susan, Susanna, and the other signers would agree with what abolitionist activist Mary Grout wrote in 1840. It is a satisfaction to believe that by the concentration of our efforts in this way, in the petitions, we do not only advance the cause of emancipation of the slave, but that the fettered mind of woman is fast releasing itself from the thraldom in which existing custom has bound it. And by the exercise of her talents in the cause of the oppressed, her intellectual as well as moral being is rising into new life. I hope they saw benefit in what they did. I do. Thank you. If anybody has any questions, please ask Gretchen.
Yes, you talked about the Grimke sisters, and you, I think, referred to the fact that they grew up in a household that owned.
Yeah, in South Carolina.
But they were Quakers.
No, they weren't Quakers then. Yeah.
Oh, they came.
They were in the Episcopal Church. And then Sarah, the older one, much older than Angelina, moved to Philadelphia, and she became a Quaker.
Thank you.
Okay. Hi.
Lydia Mariah's house on Route 27 has been a model
Yes.
in my lifetime.
Yes.
Is it not on the historical list of houses or something like that?
Gretchen will answer that.
It's been identified, but it would have to be, even if it was listed in the National Register, it wouldn't matter. It would have to be part of a local historic district in order for it to be reviewed for changes. And it's not.
Full disclosure, between remodeling, I wandered through the house, and I went back and found a bottle without a screw top. Is that even a
I don't know.
Oh, I have to find it.
I don't know, but the reason I referred you to Gretchen is she is the head of the Historic District Commission, so is the appropriate person to answer the question.
Would they have had to, so they wouldn't have gone through the rules and regs of historical houses?
No, no.
They tear down the brick wall with the...
Well, even you're limited to and Gretchen can correct me, it's more takes place in the exterior of the house, the changes that you can make. You're much less restricted in the interior of the house. No restrictions. Diana.
Hi. One thing that would be beneficial to preserving the historical assets and resources of Wayland would be if a demolition delay bylaw was passed. I was very greatly disappointed to hear that that article did not pass at town meeting. I hope that members of the community will go forward and try to educate the public here in Wayland, because then there will be, if you enacted it, there would be a period of time in which to have a dialogue with the current owner, so that then perhaps you could find a readaptive use or a compromise with a different individual that might be willing to buy the property. In Sudbury, where I live now, and I serve on the historical good window of time.
I think you will find some sympathetic people in this crowd. Yes, you've had your hand.
You didn't know what happened to Grout after this petition. Do you know why Susanna became a leader?
I think she was probably, Susanna, why she was the lead petitioner.
Well, you said
I think
her
because,
daughter, as I understood you, the Grout daughter circulated the petition.
no, I don't know if she did or not. She signed the petition.
Is that a picture of Mariah in New York? That's younger than I am.
It's probably the years that she's not here yet. Yes. But I just love her, so.
I like that.
Sorry. Kay.
I noticed the two Hyde daughters had signed the petition. Did Abby sign also?
Yeah, A.B. Hyde. It was
Oh,
A.B. For Abigail Bradley.
And they were quite late in signing because they were in the second column down towards
Yeah,
the
I don't know how the logistics of the whole thing. So I don't know if they went. They were quite young at the time. I think Julia was born in 18, so she was 18, and I think maybe Adeline might have been a little younger than Julia. Okay? Yeah. Any more questions? All right, I think you've survived and you can have goodies, and thank you so much for coming.